Good day, everyone. I'm Roland Menz, your narrator today. I'll be briefing you on a cybersecurity risk assessment for Team New Zealand and the Haitema Consulting and Contracting Company. My co-authors are Anzio Cork and Justin Joyce. An overview of what we'll be covering today will provide a situation to which will drive the discussion for the majority of this brief. Talk about the attack vectors based on that situation that was presented. Cover on authentication, authorization, and access control. Present a vulnerability matrix based off the events in the situation that was briefed. Discussing further the weaknesses within our organizational and security structure, focusing on people, technology, and policy, and providing some recommendations on how those issues that are identified through the weakness and vulnerability matrix can be remediated. Start with the situation. We're attending a Five Eyes security conference. The Five Eyes consists of the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Five Eyes is an intelligence sharing organization between these 5 countries. And at this conference, the U.S. reported that an IDS detected some data exfiltration. Also, that there was a cyber attack, which all the nations have realized. It could have resulted from a buffer overflow or denial of service. Nonetheless, the secure networks of our nations are currently down at this conference. The observed network traffic appears to be anomalous. However, the point of origin is internal to the conference network. And we, as our individual nations, will be investigating this event to determine what caused the attack. So that's the situation that drove the discussion on this brief. So first, let's talk about risk assessment. New Zealand's standards are based on the International Organizations for Standards, or ISO as they're called. And you can see that for the ISO standard that defines risks, the 3100 of 2018. And I'll let you read the paragraph there for what it says on risk assessment. But the things I do want to highlight is the words, the risk identification and risk analysis. Why is this important? Because our fellow Five Eye nations also have very similar constructs that they use. Specifically for the US, they use their National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, and their publication 853 Revision 4. And you can see I've highlighted those words, they've used it in theirs as well. So identification of risk, it's all about risk analysis. So you can see that both nations, both New Zealand and the United States, as well as our other Five Eye partners, use a very similar construct when they're looking at risk, identification and analysis of it. Furthermore, for the ISO risk management, there are 3 core components: principle, the framework, and the process. So the principles are what the standard is based on, leading to the framework that is used when you're building out the risk work, and then the process for doing that assessment. So you can see the principle is the basis for the process and the framework. The framework and the process feed each other on how we go about assessing that risk, identifying that risk. It's an interactive process because different parts will interact with other parts. It has to be communicated and working within organizations, both internally and externally to the organization. So in the case of New Zealand, we'd have to look at it not only internally, was this attack that we had in the scenario earlier, that described earlier, ourselves? Did we do this? Was there something we were unwitting about, or was it an external actor who may have been doing it against us? And it also, the ISO standard emphasizes leadership for the risk governance, because in order to actually mitigate and control risk, you have to have someone who identifies what is the risk level, what are they willing to accept when it comes to risk, which is what the ISO standard covers. So now that we've talked about risk, let's talk about what causes that risk. And those are the different attack vectors that occur. As you can see, we have 5 kind of vectors that attacks come from here. Hardware, software, the operating system, network, or telecommunication, and the human, or human factor. I'll go in depth on each of those now. Starting with the hardware. You have multiple ways in which hardware can be attacked. You have those legacy devices, as you can see in the image here on the screen. That old Macintosh, it's a very old device. It has certain vulnerabilities because it's so old, no longer supported. The software that runs on it is no longer patched or maintained, that it can be attacked. There's also the fact that if you have physical access to most hardware, there's not much that can be done to stop an adversary. They can modify or do what they will. There's also the infrastructure dependencies. Think about the computer right now you're watching this video on over the internet. You require a modem. That modem requires a router. That router requires DNS, IP traffic from other routers in order to transmit your data. Those are all dependencies within the computer realm, the information realm, and the cyber realm that can be attacked through cyberspace, which I'll go into some of those attack vectors a little bit later in this slideshow. So on to the operating system. Now, if you really think about this, the operating system is a type of software, and also is what runs on the hardware. It is primarily the attack vector that most things actually go after. What are some of those attack vectors for the operating system that are attacked then? Well, you have a buffer overflow, and that's where memory that is supposed to be contained within a certain area is actually outside that area. And when it's pushed outside that area, the attacker will try and inject a piece of code outside that area, enabling them to exploit a system and control it. Once they have that initial access using an attack like a buffer overflow, they may try and use another attack vector, such as privilege escalation. And that's where they would go from trying to have a user level account that they may have, so my own user level account where I'm not the system or root, and try and get to a system or root level access where they have unfettered ability to control and manage the system. They could also try exploiting it through auto run from removable media. This is a little bit older of an exploit, but that's essentially where you would plug in a USB device and the operating system automatically runs the first executable that it sees. Well, if that executable is a piece of malware to exploit the operating system, then it can be exploited. There's also denial of service. This is where the system interacts a certain way with information that it's sent. So an attacker will send large quantities of that data, or specifically crafted pieces of data, to force that system to have to process a large quantity of information or continuously get into a loop and process data and not able to provide the service that it was intended to provide, which is operate your system. So moving on to software, as I said, the operating system is technically a piece of software. This is where you get to the, well, what, attack software? Malware. Malware is very wide encompassing. It includes worms, viruses, Trojans. Those are all forms of malware. Malicious software trying to exploit a system. And some of those things they try to exploit are things like weak access controls. Think of it like, I have access to a file share. You do not. But that access I can grant you. Well, that's a weak access control because I, as the user, can control that access versus an administrator controlling access to sensitive data. You also have just unpatched software. The first thing that an attacker does is scan a system to determine what software is on there. If they see there's something old, a legacy piece of software, or something that a recent exploit came out and hasn't been patched, that's what they will try and find that exploit to go after it. Another form of attack vector is called watering hole. This is essentially exploiting a piece of software such as an internet browser or a plugin on an internet browser that someone will go to a website and it gets exploited because it's a watering hole because everyone goes to drink at the water, everyone goes to the website. Think of it as if you went to Google and then that image that they have from time to time on the Google main page is delivering malware because it exploits the image rendering software in your browser. That would be an example. On to networking attack vectors now. Starting with distributed denial of service attacks. This is very similar to denial of service we saw with the operating system. However, it's a variant because of the fact that we have a network. And you can have multiple sources attacking your service that's being provided. And think of it in the terms of hundreds or thousands of systems attacking that one device, having a single or a few systems attack your service. Man in the middle attack, just as the image shows there on the screen, you have two people communicating with each other, and there's someone in the middle to either intercept and record that information or to inject information to manipulate it along the path between the two users. Then there's spoofing. This is where you would receive a message and you think it's coming from mom, but it's really coming from Bob, the bad guy. Essentially, this works because there's no way to authenticate the source of the message. Thus, they're able to spoof or fake the information to make you believe it's someone else, commonly used in phishing. Then there's poisoning. DNS, cache, ARP poisoning, these are all types of poisoning, to where you are trying to force a system to believe that another system is the legitimate source. So let's put the scenario of DNS cache poisoning. This is where an adversary would try to inject DNS responses saying that their IP is the right web address that you want to go to, but it's the legitimate address of a website you're going to. And then they would poison that by injecting this information either into the DNS server you're going to receive that information or to your system directly. Then you have route hijacking. This is a little higher level of an attack, usually done at a nation-state level or a high-end attacker, to where they would manipulate the routes in the routing tables of routers and force traffic to go in a different direction. This could be used to, say, send traffic coming from Europe through China to the United States versus just going over the Atlantic undersea cable. Again, it's about sending traffic, so you could do something like man in the middle to be able to collect or manipulate that traffic going through it. Lastly, we have the attack vector of the human factor. The hardest thing to detect and or prevent. You have the insider threat. This is the legitimate user who's authorized to be on the network but has malicious intent and wants to cause damage or harm for whatever reason or justification that they have. Then there's the social engineering aspect. This doesn't have to technically be done technically. It could be done face-to-face, in person, over the phone, but it's the manipulation of your user base through social means of interaction. Spamming. We've all gotten that Nigerian email saying we've got $1 million in the bank account, but we just have to send them 10,000 to get access to it. That is an attempt by sending large amounts of messages to people, hoping that someone replies, usually with an enticing message that someone would reply to, such as monetary gain. Then there's always the unwitting or the untrained user. And I'll point to the image there of Homer Simpson on a computer. Doesn't really understand that you can push any of the keys on the keyboard. He's like, where's the any key? Or as we like to call it in the tech world, the stupid user. Because that stupid user can do something that can destroy a system unknowing or unwitting to themselves. And with human factors, that concludes our attack vectors. Starting with best practices and authentication. What is authentication? A process by which a claimed identity is verified and access permissions are confirmed before access is granted. There are authentication factors which enable that to occur. They start with something you know, something you have, and something you are. Something you know being a password or a phrase, something you have like your cell phone or a common access card, something you are, think of biometric, your fingerprint, your retina scan. Combinations of these factors make the authentication more robust and confident that the person is who they say they are, because someone can steal your password, and can we authenticate that it's you? Can someone steal your cell phone? But if you use something you know and something you have in combination, that increases the verification that you are who you say you are. Two-factor authentication is common amongst the 5 countries. You also need to maintain the confidentiality and integrity of the communication when authenticating. Usually this is done through encryption, because if that communication can be manipulated, then the integrity or the authenticity cannot be verified of the individual. And moving on from authentication, we'll move on to authorization and access control. Authorization is identifying the resources the subscriber or user has permissions to access. So think of it as, do I have access to be able to read my files on my computer? I should, I hope. And there are different ways in which those access control methods or that authorization is checked against. You have role-based access controls, mandatory access controls, attribute-based access controls, and discretionary access controls. RBAC is granted to the individual based on their role. Think of it like a group permission. If I'm in the finance department, I probably won't have access to the security department's files and permission set. Mandatory access control, usually used in security classification levels, is where the security level or access permission is checked against what is being accessed and the user accounts every time, and they must match because it is mandatory that you have the permissions, otherwise you will not be able to access them. Attribute access controls are granted based on the attributes of the individual. So, for instance, if I wanted to be able to access a website, but my requirement to access the website is that my computer have certain specifications, then those attributes would be what grants me the permission to access them. Or maybe, for instance, you have to have your phone at a certain location in order to access your bank account. That would be an attribute-based access control. I must have an attribute, my location, and I must have my phone in order to access the data. Then there's discretionary access control. This is granted by the information owner, or the person who has the information or control, and passed on to another user. Think of this like a Unix permission for read, write, execute. I can grant you read, and then you'll be able to read from that. And if you have the write permission, then you can write the permissions for the file after I grant it to you. Kind of the opposite from a mandatory access control, where it's granted by the user versus mandatory, it's controlled by the system. So we covered multiple attack vectors and how an adversary could come after us. We talked about some best practices with authentication, authorization, and access control. Now let's tie this all together with the situation and present the vulnerability matrix. This is presenting based on the situation where that attack occurred, what vulnerabilities were discovered. You can see in the vulnerability column the details of those vulnerabilities. Following that is the category. What kind of category do these vulnerabilities fall under? Exploitation of a policy, the technical implementation of that software, the operating system, a human factor. Those are the type of categories it falls under. What type of threat can utilize this? Bad actor, an intentional actor, an insider threat. Those would be the types of threats we would look at. And then you can see when it was published and or revised. Some of these are quite old, such as the one from 2009. And then it got revised in 2019, because obviously it is still being used. And you can see those attack vectors, as I just discussed earlier, how the vulnerabilities fall under those different attack vectors. And the important column on this is the impact and assessment. It's looking at the impact from that vulnerability and associating it with some type of risk level. Obviously low is a low risk of it happening or being exploited and thus impacting us, versus a high one where it's a high probability of it being exploited and then impacting us, thus a higher risk. I'll go more in depth on that organizational weaknesses, focusing on the people, the technology, and the policy that now this matrix is driven. To start with people and the weaknesses in our organization. There's always the insider threat. It's hard to detect them, it's hard to find them. They're an authorized person who we've given permission and authority to, but they have a malicious intent. We did not detect someone, but something malicious obviously happened on the network in this scenario. Then there's always the unwitting or uneducated user. They click the link, thus allowing the malware to spread. In either situation, this could have been what happened to the network in this scenario. Furthermore, technology, misconfiguration. It is very easy to not have a system with all the security controls implemented on it, or to have all the configuration to control the security levels on the system. An example, maybe originally people were able to access all the files on the hard drive and change them. Well, a better configuration would be to limit them to only the files which they need to access, such as their user directory on a computer. They don't need to access the operating system configurations. That would be a misconfiguration. You also have unpatched systems. If they go unpatched when there is a known patch out there, then it can be exploited. You have legacy systems. As I showed earlier with that Macintosh, if you're still running Macintosh 1.0, it's probably at its end of life, end of support, and it can be attacked and exploited very easily, which most locations, including within New Zealand and Haitama, those systems are out there. They're usually there because there's some dependency on a service that they are there for. And because we have some of these older systems, maybe they can be exploited through a denial of service. As the scenario has shown, we were able to have a denial of service done against us. So we are obviously weak in that aspect. On to policy. There's the organizational and administrative policy, such as making sure we have our acceptable use, or AUP, acceptable use policy for all our users, understanding what it is that they are allowed to do and not allowed to do, and how are we going to enforce that. A non-disclosure agreement for our secure network. It probably needs to have a non-disclosure agreement of the fact that you can't tell anyone what we are doing on it. This is a legal binding thing for our policies to prevent people from releasing our secrets. Especially as Haitama, a contracting company, we work within the classified realm. A consent to monitor. This would enable the network defenders to monitor network traffic for malicious activity. However, privacy concerns come up. So to overcome those privacy concerns, we want to have a consent to monitor policy, that people have to consent to it in order to use the system and/or network. And then laying out what are the responsibilities of our leadership and the employees. When there is an attack, should they respond? When they see there's a vulnerability, or if they're receiving spam emails, what do they do? Those are the policies that we need to make sure we have in place. Many we do have in place in New Zealand and at the Haitama consulting company, but not all of them. Then there's the technical policies. These are the things that drive the technicians to make sure that they have the systems to the level that is required to defend it against such attacks in the future. So you have the system baseline requirements. What should the system look like? What is the gold standard of that system? Policy enforcement mechanisms. What do we have to enforce the policy? Is there malware? Is there not malware? Vulnerability assessments. When is the last time we did a vulnerability assessment? Obviously, the attack that occurred exploited a vulnerability. Could we have caught it had we done an assessment? And then what is the account authorization, the authority level, what is the permission level that the users have while they're on the network? Is that being managed? How do we resolve the weaknesses that were identified and the vulnerabilities that were identified in the matrix from earlier? Let's start with some of those recommendations to resolve these issues. Starting with training. Training can solve a lot of issues. If the users understand what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do things, what they should do in response when they see an incident or something potentially malicious, you can prevent a lot of malicious or a lot of downtime by simply having your users trained. Patching your systems. Several of the things in the vulnerability matrix, the best remediation for them was to patch them to a more current version of the software. The second part to that is validating that the patch was properly installed, because if a patch wasn't installed, then that means your system is misconfigured, or the system may be misconfigured intentionally. That can help identify where someone could potentially have already exploited you. That's where that validation is important. Update your user policy. Updating our user policy to include updates to the acceptable use policy, the consent to monitor, the roles and responsibilities during an incident of the user, of our leadership. If those are updated and documented, then we can ensure they're being followed and enforced. Least privilege, getting back to that authorization part. What is the user authorized to do? What privileges do they need to do that? Getting it to the lowest level to where they only need what they need and not giving them more. Network monitoring. As a scenario, as I spoke at the very beginning, the USA saw data exfiltration because they were monitoring the network. Having network monitoring on your network, whether it be on the host system or at a higher network level, can help identify attacks or malicious activities that occurs on your systems and in the network. Updating legacy hardware. Older systems have lots of exploits on them. They can be attacked. They're no longer supported, so they're not going to be patched to prevent those attacks. By having a lifecycle management process, you can update the legacy hardware and even the software on older systems with a plan, with milestones, in order to achieve that goal. Configuration validation. Similar to patching system validation, is your system configured to enforce the policies? Does it have the correct software on it? Is it built to operate in the standard method to which you want it to? This is where, in say a Windows system, you would go into the registry and look at how all the registries are configured. Are there extra ones? That's probably an indicator of something malicious being done. And did we mention training? Because again, if you train your people to identify these things and you train your people to use the system correctly, a lot of these problems can be prevented. So again, I gave you a situation where we were at a Five Eyes conference and there was an attack and we needed to assess that. Then we discussed several attack vectors and how an adversary can use those to attack us. We went over authentication, authorization, and access control. We discussed the vulnerability matrix that was assessed based on that situational scenario of an attack. And we discussed some of the weaknesses in our organizational security, focusing on the people, the technology, and the policy, and then provided some recommendations for the way ahead on how to remediate some of those issues. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes the brief.